Hello, this is James, and this is response video number 4. Um, in this video, we'll be going in depth into chapter 9 and 10 of Rediscovery of America. Chapter 9 goes more in depth into the native side of the American Civil War and how it affected their communities, a side of the war that is like hardly covered. We start with an intro to multiple things that are dividing opinions on slavery in the U.S., such as the fugitive slave law, the Dred Scott decision, and the rise of the Republican Party. In 1860, Southern states seceded, starting the Civil War, and then in 1863, Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery, ensuring a Union victory that would reshape the South. Meanwhile, or ensuring that if a Union victory were to happen, it would reshape the South. Meanwhile, settlers moved west, displacing indigenous people and disrupting their economies. We then jump back to 1851 when the Treaty of Traversay des Sioux confined Dakota bands to a fraction of their land, but settlers quickly overwhelmed that small areas, and then limited federal presence enabled settlers to commit widespread violence. And then in 1862, violations of the treaty led to war. And then after defeat, the 38 Dakota were hanged, largest in like the U.S. That is like the largest U.S. mass execution, and the survivors were exiled. In California, militias killed tens of thousands of Native Americans, while federal Indian policies were poorly enforced. Railroads and settlement eroded indigenous economies, forcing some tribes to raid for survival. I found this interesting because when I think of violent acts being done on Native populations, I think of the East Coast. I don't know why that is. Like, I know the Spanish did plenty of bad things on the West Coast, but when you think of the U.S., you never really think of the West Coast and Native populations going through as many struggles. And I feel that it's presented that way in school. During the Civil War, some Oklahoma tribes aligned with the Confederacy, believing that it would protect their independence, while others sided with the Union, which is also weird because I feel like wouldn't native population, I mean, they must have told the native population something to make them think this way, but it feels like they're racist, are they not going to eventually can just do something to you? I don't know. But mining operations during the war seized native lands, displacing communities and fueling economic growth. Union forces violently suppressed indigenous resistance, such as the Long Walk of Dime and the Bear River Massacre. In Colorado, some native resistance led to violent retaliation, and the federal massacre of natives further spread anti-indigenous ideas and violence. And that was about the end of chapter 9. I mean, into chapter 10, with going more into depth in Native history in the West and the clash between territorial and federal laws. During Reconstruction, some towns, such as Yuma in Arizona, grew around railway systems, attracting settlers globally. Legal battles like the one between Mary H. Taylor and Lucia Martinez highlighted conflicts between territorial and federal law. New legal systems in the West enforced restrictions on natives, redefining native lands and families. Reservation policies divided native lands, allocating small pieces of land to individuals while selling the rest. Boarding schools, led by people like Captain Richard Henry Pratt, forcibly assimilated native children to erase their cultures. During Reconstruction, the government signed treaties recognizing the native sovereignty over vast lands, forced relocations of Indian territory continued. Kansas became a hub for railroads and cattle ranching after the removal of many native tribes, and the large reservations like the Lokata and Navajo lands faced issues from settler encroachment. The Black Hills served as a vital hunting ground and spiritual site for the Sioux tribe, but the discovery of gold in 1874 by a U.S. military expedition led to a huge amount of settlers moving into the area and the forced removal of the Sioux from their land. This led to the Great Sioux War in 1876, ending in 1877, which is the Lakota Act, which diminished Native independence and the growth of federal power. Which diminished Native independence and also gave growth or led to growth of federal power. Policies such as boarding schools and attacks on traditional kinship systems targeted Native cultures through land ownership reforms. Um, in response to this, some groups, such as the Ghost Dance movement, tried to revitalize Native cultural resistance, but were met with violence. The dance was a huge 4-day round dance involving multiple traditional acts. The Bureau of Indian Affairs viewed the dance as a threat and feared it was like a prelude to war. Um, at Wounded Knee, the U.S. Army massacred a huge group of ghost dance worshippers, marking like a dark moment in Native history. In general, these chapters taught me like quite a bit about history I was never taught in school. It feels like Native struggles were only shown in pre-Civil War era, like the people came over from Europe and did all these horrible things, and then we start getting more into the U.S. history, and you kind of forget about it, and they start going more into and they switch to like African and women's struggle or African Americans and women's struggles. And I feel that's just as important, but it's interesting that they kind of drop it right after the Civil War. It's like, oh, well, now they're fine and we're going to switch over to this other thing. So um, it's interesting that Natives just kind of disappeared from teachings after the Civil War. Or at least that's how I felt about what I was taught in high school and for them.